Good afternoon. Welcome to the Academy of Parish Clergies. We're going to call this for now our monthly book talk based on our annual Book of the Year event. And we had conversations with the Book of the Year awardee and the reference book of the year awardee, but we also named top 10 books and then top 5 reference books. And so what we're trying to do is have a conversation with all of these book authors because their books are excellent and we want to recognize and honor them. And so this is something new. And so our first of these, what I'm going to for now call Book Talk. We may change that name over time, but we're here with David Beldman, who is the author of a commentary on Judges from the Two Horizons Old Testament Commentary Series. And before we get started, I want Barb Lorbach, who is the president of our organization, just to give a welcome to those who might be watching and just a reminder of who we are as the Academy of Parish Clergy.
Hello, I'm Barbara Lorbach. I'm a pastor in Illinois, and I'm the current president for the Academy of Parish Clergy, a group that exists to help pastors share the practice of being a pastor and to better ourselves as pastors. And one of our long-awaited annual events is our Book of the Year and the top 10 book of the year and our reference book of the year. So we are excited today to hear from another one of the authors. This is one of the pieces of our annual conference that is always one of the things that we realize that even a small organization like the Academy can offer to local parish clergy, interfaith folks in almost like getting a seminary class when we meet with these authors. So we're looking forward to hearing from Dave today.
Thank you, Barb. So in a moment, we're going to hear from Dave as he explains what it means to write a commentary on the book of Judges. And you can see there's a cover there.
Yeah, I'm trying to get
showing there. Just a couple of things before we kind of dive in here. So Dave is the Associate Professor of Religion and Theology at Redeemer University College I live in Metro Detroit, so I'll say across the river in Ontario, Canada. Which unfortunately, because of COVID, that transit between our two countries and our two state provinces has been not available. But he has written this excellent commentary that in a series that combines exegetical work with theological work. And for those of us who are preachers, the theological component is always helpful. So that we can learn more than simply what it meant, but back then, but maybe how it might translate to today. Now, the question came up as to how often is Judges in the lectionary, and it's only twice. And so that means that if we're going to play with the book of Judges as preachers, we may have to venture beyond the lectionary, which maybe Dave can help us understand why maybe we ought to venture beyond that. But before we get there, before we have Dave talk to us about the commentary and how he wrote it and why he wrote it and why Judges is important, I wanted Ron Green, who is one of our Academy members, but also part of our, along with Jess Golton, part of our committee that made this choice. And Ron was the one who really wanted this commentary. So Ron, if you're there and able to to speak to what it is about this commentary. Oh, and then Ron disappeared. Ron is living in the middle of nowhere in Eastern Washington. So Ron, are you there? Well, maybe we'll get Ron in at the end. In the meantime, Dave, I'm going to leave it to you if you want to share about the commentary about Judges and why we ought to read it and study it and preach on it, which is what we clergy do. Let us know what it is about that, and then we'll ask you some questions afterwards.
Yeah, sounds great. So thank you very much. It seems like almost customary and cliche to say how honored I am and that sort of thing, but it really is an honor for two reasons at least. And the first is that of all the books in 2020 that you could have chosen, you chose a commentary on Judges. So that's pretty significant. I spent a lot of many years actually studying Judges, starting with my doctoral dissertation, which was on the ending of Judges, but asking this question: what kind of ending is this, and how does it end the book? Which gets you into all the questions of, what's going on in the book of Judges. So I spent a lot of time, and then I followed that up with this commentary, and also the fact that this book was honored by people who are clergy, that you found this book helpful or potentially helpful for clergy to what I like to say, open up the riches of Judges. And so I wrote it for that reason. So I am really honored that you recognized it for that reason. I'm assuming that whoever is on this call or on the Facebook feed there hasn't read the commentary. So I'm not assuming that you have read my commentary. I'm not even assuming necessarily that you've read Judges. I hope you have a bit of an understanding of what Judges is and some of the stuff in there. You probably know Samson or Gideon. So I want to do a couple of things. I want to answer Barbara asked that question, why Judges? Why do a commentary on Judges? So I'll answer that in a second. But the two main things I want to do is just give you kind of a bird's eye view of what I think, sort of a bird's eye view of Judges and what's going on in Judges. It's interesting that the lectionary has two passages from Judges. Unless you have a bird's eye picture of what's going on in Judges, I think is a really good chance you're going to miss on these like little bits and pieces. So I'm going to try to do that. And then I'll try at the end to give some indication of why this might be important today. Why Judges? So the question of why Judges for me was actually not too sexy, actually. I had to do I was doing a doctoral dissertation. The topic that I landed on was ending. So I just found it curious that in Old Testament literature, we have just very interesting and intriguing endings to the Old Testament books. So if you think, I just love Jonah. It ends with a question. I think the only book in the Bible that ends with a question. Now, that's just interesting, right? It's intriguing, but also think rhetorically, what does that do? Right? What does it do when Jonah ends with this question? Should I not be merciful to, this many Ninevites and all their cattle too? And that's put to Jonah, and we don't know how Jonah would have answered that. A chapter earlier, we would have said, Jonah would have answered that, no, you shouldn't be merciful. We don't know if he made that transformation, but then that question just kind of echoes down through the centuries, right? And comes to us, right? So who are these people in our context that we may have a tendency not to think that God's mercy should apply to them? And how does that question hit us? We're not talking about Jonah here, but there are interesting endings. Amos, all this judgment for 11 chapters, and then just a few verses at the end of restoration and planting the people in the land and restoring them and so on. Some very interesting endings. So I was going to do a dissertation on endings, how they work, unpacking them, maybe even trying to do like a classification of different kinds of endings. Well, that was way too ambitious. I was going to land on 3 different case studies. I started with Judges, and there was enough in a dissertation just for Judges. So that's how it came about. I didn't have like a burning desire to, study Judges for 3 years, although I don't regret it at all. And this is the interesting thing for me, anyways, about Scripture, is that no matter what I'm studying, I mean, if the deeper you go, I think the more riches you find. So Judges, I mean, the question that Barbara posed to me, why Judges? If you've read Judges, you know why that question is pertinent, right? This is a strange book. It's a troubling book, if we're honest. There's some very troubling material in there. So let's just put that out there. There's violence. There's actually some pretty brutal violence against women. There's just bizarre behavior. And what do we make of all of this? So let me just give you a brief overview. So Judges has 3 sections. It's got a beginning, it's got a middle, it's got an end. The middle part is probably the stuff we know best, right? So those are the stories of the judges themselves. And that's structured in a cycle, right? So 5 different elements to the cycle. So Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. The cycle always starts. There's 6 of these in the center. It always starts with Israel doing evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then the Lord, this arouses his anger, and he sends oppression to the people. The people cry out because of their oppression. The Lord then responds by raising up a deliverer who delivers the people, and the land has rest. So those are the 5 elements. Some brilliant person alliterated them, but I don't have them in front of me. But anyway, so there are these cycles of judges. It starts with Othniel, and then it goes to Ehud, and then Deborah, and Gideon, Jephthah, Samson. 6 cycles of judges. Those are the kind of Sunday school stories that we might be familiar with. But it starts in a different place. It starts with one chapter of showing how the people, so the whole book is giving a kind of it's not really, I don't want to say it's a history of the settlement period, because it's very selective, but it's happening during the settlement period. And I think the author is trying to say, this is what characterized the settlement period. After they had conquered the land, what was it like? And that first chapter shows how Israel failed to drive out the people, and they were progressively worse at it. So that's chapter 1. And then chapter 2 is really important because it gives the framework for understanding the book of Judges and this settlement period. And it actually announces that cycle. This is what it was like in Israel. The people did evil in the eyes of the Lord. God sends oppression. They cry out to the Lord, and so on. So it anticipates what we're going to see in the middle part. Okay. A really important, I should have my Bible here, a really important verse in the introduction that really is kind of important for unpacking it is 2 verse 10. So it says, all this bad behavior. And then before it announces the cycle, it says, and all that generation, that first generation who had been involved in the conquest and so on, and all that generation, so Joshua dies, and all that generation were also gathered to their fathers, and there arose another generation after them who did not know the Lord or the work he had done for Israel. Okay, so one generation, and we have people who don't know the Lord and all that he had done, like the exodus from Egypt, the care for Israel in the wilderness, his leading them into the promised land, and so on. So that's really important. They didn't know. That should already be raising huge red flags. How is it possible that in one generation these people didn't know? So what's going on? So that's really key. Then we get the cycle. And I could say a lot about the cycle. I'm supposed to get 15 minutes, so I can't say everything, but it's just brilliantly crafted. And those elements of the cycle, those 5 elements, they're not just sort of slavishly, like the events aren't slavishly put into that kind of framework. So not all those elements appear, right? So for example, a really good example is in the Samson narrative. After the people do evil in the eyes of the Lord, God sends the oppression. They don't cry out. So that element is missing. So they're not crying out to the Lord. It says that in the Jephthah cycle, Israel does evil in the eyes of the Lord. God sends the oppression, and God determines not to raise up a deliverer, and Jephthah is the choice of the people. So, these literary patterns are really important, right? So we need to be able to identify them, but then we shouldn't just think that they're slavishly followed. And when elements are missing, it's almost always going to be rhetorical, right? So when Jephthah isn't the choice of the people, what are we going to expect? Well, we're not going to expect rest to come to the land. And actually, that element is missing from the Jephthah account. So as we go through the cycle, it's not just like a cycle, but many people have indicated that it's a spiral downward. So with each, so Othniel is kind of like the paradigm, the best kind of judge. Ehud, I think, pretty good. With Gideon, it goes it starts to go downhill, and it just gets worse from Gideon. So that's really important. So there's a generation that didn't know the Lord and all that he had done. Then there's these cycles where Israel is just getting worse and worse. Their leaders are getting worse and worse. Then we get to the end section, which is Judges 17 through 21. And this is the stuff that really we can make joke of it, make light of it, but it is really, really just very troubling. So there's rape and there's dismemberment and just terrible stuff. So there's these two incidences, and we get a new refrain in there. So we don't get the cycle anymore, but we get a new refrain, and that happens 4 times, one at the beginning, one at the very end, and 2 other places in between. And the refrain is, there's no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. And so we get this refrain in the context of some of the worst behavior that we see in the book. Okay. Which in a way it kind of makes sense with how the book is unfolding. So in the middle section, things are getting worse and worse and worse. And then we get to the end, and it's like the absolute worst. And then we get this refrain, which I think is the author is cueing it, like, pay attention. This is important. This is what it's all about. Like, in those days, there was no king. Now, what does that mean? I'm just going to check my time here. Okay. What does it mean that there was no king? Now, scholars debate this. I'm just going to give you my view, and then I can take questions about it. But I think primarily the no king in Israel is referring to Yahweh's kingship, God's kingship, which has been a theme, in the Exodus. It's there, and it's throughout Scripture, but it's there beforehand. If you go to Samuel, 1 Samuel, when the people actually want a king, right? They ask Samuel for a king, and Samuel's kind of bent out of shape because he's bent out of shape because they think this is a rejection of him because he's their judge. And God says, look, they don't be upset because they haven't rejected you as king, but they've rejected me as king. Ever since they left Egypt, they've rejected me as king. Now, if I'm right on that, so the no king of Israel is saying, Israel has abandoned Yahweh as their king. And this is the kind of behavior that we can expect. Now, if you think of that, God is king, there's all this language in Judges about, we see at the end of Joshua, people committed to serving Yahweh. This is kind of kingship language. It's like allegiance, right? So they're pledging their allegiance to Yahweh. And then in Judges, we get this flip-flopping language of abandoning Yahweh. We could almost say, like, this is like high treason, deserting the king, Yahweh, and then serving the Baals, the Ashtoreths, and whatever, the gods of the Canaanites. Now, if we know anything about Scripture, we know that they shouldn't be worshiping other idols. Now, why, you might think, why shouldn't they be serving other gods, right? Is God just this kind of like petty God that is all jealous and what God knows, and I think this is clear in Exodus and Deuteronomy and so on, the Sinai covenant, that when a people worships, what they worship is going to play out in how they live. And so at Sinai, God is saying, worship me alone, and then know who I am, what I'm like, and then build a society based on my values, based on what I love, and so on. And that's what the Sinai covenant does. What we see in Judges is the people abandon Yahweh, they serve the gods, and what happens? They build a society based on the Canaanite gods, their values. So let me just give you one example, because I've got to just watch the time here. That the narrative in chapter 19 and 20, where this terrible atrocity happens in Gibeah, right? And these Benjamin men do this terrible thing. And so all the rest of Israel comes and says, give up these men. They come to the tribe of Benjamin, give up these men so that, justice can be done. And what does Benjamin do? They rally around the men of Gibeah. Now we just think, why would they do that? Well, according to ancient Near Eastern Canaanite, the sort of thought world of the ancient Near East, there's no sort of fix like right and wrong. The measure of what is right and wrong is what is good for my tribe, right? So, for you to take people out of my tribe and execute them or whatever justice, that's not good. We want to take care of our tribe. So what Benjamin is doing there is very natural from a Canaanite point of view, right? And it's just one example. I could give you lots of examples, but they've abandoned Yahweh, they've served the gods of the nation, and they start building a society and a culture based on the Canaanite values and that sort of thing. Okay, I'm probably missing a lot of stuff. Why does this matter? I mean, it's kind of interesting, wow, that's neat. But why does it matter? I think I'm going to be controversial here, and I don't really know my audience. So if you don't like what I have to say, you can just say, "Oh, well, that's a Canadian," and he can. So let me back up just a little bit. When we get to the end and we see these terrible things happen, and just how there's a sort of chronological thing, which the stuff at the end happens very early, right? And if you follow the clues, you realize the stuff at the end doesn't happen after a long period of time as Israel's sort of falling apart and crumbling. It happens early. And I think that functions rhetorically as a shock, right? So we should think, wow, how is it that they could be so bad so early? And that's the right question. And then we should sort of go back and look at like, what's going on here? Now, one thing, Deuteronomy, which is kind of very much in the background of Judges, Deuteronomy is this sort of a series of sermons. So you clergy should love this thing. A series of sermons by Moses as he's sending the people off into the promised land. And what's the theme of Deuteronomy? Well, I'm not a Deuteronomy scholar, but just my own sense is something about memory, right? Remember, don't forget. And it's not a cognitive thing, it's an identity thing. So remember those things that Yahweh did, how you were in slavery and God brought you out. Remember how he cared for you in the wilderness, but remember how he brought you to the promised land. And Moses is it's like a memory sermon. So there are three things in Deuteronomy that are kind of like mnemonic devices, or these techniques of memory. So the one is tell the stories. When your son asks you, what about all these laws and statutes? Tell them we were slaves in Egypt. And think about these things, ponder them as you're getting up, think about them as you go to sleep, as you walk along the way, bind them to your wrists and your forehead, and so on. So tell these stories again and again and again. Let them get deep down into you, so that it's not just your ancestors who God got out of Egypt, but that was us. God, we're free because of what God had done. So tell the stories, do the rituals. Right? So there are all these ritual things. and I don't know what kind of group I'm speaking to here, but in my kind of traditions, we don't like ritual. We think that's what Catholics do or whatever. But we are ritual beings, and God knows that, and Moses knew it. And so he says, do these habitual things every day. So morning, evening, every week, every couple of months, every 7 years, every 50 years, do these rituals, not so that like you can have your holy moments, but that these holy moments, uh, they they fuel you for a whole life and a whole society lived under the reign of Yahweh, right? So tell the stories, uh, um, do the rituals, and sing the songs. So Moses' song. So song is very interesting. The Psalter, and so imagination, emotions. Uh, so we enter into this imaginative world where possibilities open up. We express the brokenness of the world and see the heights of joy as we worship God. But sing those songs, because I mean, anyone who's been around kids know that if you want kids to remember something, give them a song, right? So tell the stories, do the rituals, sing the songs. How is it that in Judges the people could go so badly? Well, they're not telling the stories, not in a way that really gets down deep into them so that they know who they are. They're not doing the rituals. There's some ritual activity in Judges, but it's all sorts of, it's twisted and bound up with Canaanite worship. And they're not singing the songs. It's a little controversial. I think the song of Deborah, if you compare it to the Song of Moses, it's very interesting. There's a lot of parallels, but the Song of Moses is just like God is king. God is almost on every line. Deborah's song, I don't want to sort of diminish Deborah, but it's very kind of anthropocentric. So, what the people did. And I think it pales. But anyways, the songs are not the songs that will animate the people for their calling. Now, what I was going to say, I was going to get controversial here. So from north of the border, looking into America, for a while, but especially the last year, it does seem like a crazy world. We got our own problems, but so things like Christian nationalism and these sorts of things, which just seem so bizarre. Like as a Canadian, just seems so bizarre to me. But how is it that that some of the things that are being perpetuated, some of the things that are being combated, and so on, how is it that that can be so bound up with the Christian religion, right? And I think, as if I may, you don't have to think about me anymore after this webinar, but I think as Americans, you do a really good job of telling the American story in a certain way, which in many ways is kind of bound up with the Christian story in a kind of weird way. The rituals, I think there are rituals. I just think of, this bizarre thing that you do, pledging allegiance to the flag, which I don't know. I mean, let's talk about that. That seems very weird. But this is something we do with our kids every morning. And then I hear stories about how there are certain, religious people who won't pledge allegiance. And then what kind of dynamic does that have in the classroom among kids? That's an interesting thing. But there are other rituals. How about singing the songs? Well, I think whether they're not just national anthems, but other sort of anthems that you sing, even some of the hymns that sort of bound up this nationalism with the Christian faith. It's an interesting thing. So are we surprised then that we, some of the things that come out anyway, far too controversial. I don't even know if this was wise to do, but I think what it's saying is, look, have a look at Judges, because that might provide a mirror for us to see some things that we might not be able to see. Part of the problem, even for Israel, right, is that it would be the most natural thing in the ancient Near East when you're moving into a new area, which is what Israel was doing, to figure out who the local deities are, right? That's the most natural thing to do, and not abandon Yahweh. No, nobody in Israel would have said, yeah, we had enough of that Yahweh God, like we'll do these gods. No, it's just sort of natural from a worldly perspective for them to find out who these local deities are, and do the syncretism thing, right? And I mean, for us, we just think, how stupid. Why would you do idol worship? It just it just seems so bizarre. But I wonder if we could get some Israelites in a time machine, have a walk with us, be with us in our homes, come into our churches, look at our worship, look at what we do with our leisure or whatever. They would say, how stupid are we North Americans? Like, you think you're worshiping Jesus Christ, but you've got these idols like right alongside him. And I think Judges, if we can see like the power of idolatry and the allure and the what's the word here? Just the sneakiness of idolatry, right? It's not always like sort of in your face. It just kind of becomes bound up with these other things. But we need some mirrors like this. I think this is why the global church is really important as well, because sometimes it's so easy for us to see, in these global contexts, like there's idolatry or whatever. But we need the global church to be able to say in the West, like, what are the idols that are compromising our witness? The interesting thing about Israel is that God gave them this calling. God gave them a kind of marching orders for how to build a kind of just society, one where the nations would look in and say, how do we become a part of that? Because it's so just and the peace just abounds there. So they're compromising on their calling and their ethic. It's no good for Israel, but it's not good for the nations that they're called to bless. And I think for us too, this blending of idolatry with the Christian faith, it's not good for us. Like it's not life, the kind of life that Jesus says, life and life in abundance. And it's certainly no good for our witness. I feel like it's a terrible spot to end, but I feel like I'm over my time already. So I'm sure there's lots of questions, but go for it.
Well, I'll jump in here, and I'm Ron Green, and I drove 30 miles to get better internet access, and that shows what happens to you. So on my third entry into this Zoom meeting through a third route, I think it was mentioned that Judges only occurs once in the Revised Common Lectionary, and it's just the beginning of the story of Deborah. It doesn't go to the fullness there, and we need Judges. For a while in ministry, for about 15 years, I was doing two worship services, one on Wednesday nights as well as Sunday mornings. And Wednesday night I was always looking for a series, and so one season I went through Judges and pushed the people with those stories, and it was hard to find good commentaries. Dave, I wish I'd had your commentary at the time, because so many people they ignore Judges or they explain it away. I remember as a youth reading through the Living Bible when it first came out and explaining away the thing about Jephthah's daughter, that she grieved that she would remain a virgin and not marry, instead of the hard truth that's in there. Or they make excuses for the behavior. And I don't know how you can excuse the person of God, a Levite, for what he did with his concubine, that nobody should be treated that way. But you wrestled with the text and brought theological depth in your commentary, and I appreciate that. And what you were talking about are other idols, and so I'll lift up an innocuous one. I love my Christmas trees, and I'm primarily German heritage. But when it came to the church, I would remind the people that my ancestors worshipped trees and practiced human sacrifice in Germany, and we don't worship trees. We worship Jesus Christ, and it's hard for people to see that sometimes. But I really appreciate what you've done, because we need these biblical stories lifted up so that we understand, what does it mean to say to put out a fleece? And is that faith or is that a doubt? And the whole thing about Samson, and then the women. So my question finally, Dave, is would you talk more about how Judges presents women? Because you have Deborah and you have Jael, and that then you have the Levite's concubine, you have Delilah with her thing, and Samson's first wife, and how she treats mother. So if you explored a little more about that, I'd appreciate that.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for those words. Yeah. So and yeah, I didn't highlight that, but so a lot of bad teaching in the church on Judges, which is probably why we don't like it, right? I think if we could just put a moratorium on putting, the figures of Judges in kids' Bible curriculum until we figure out how to do it well, right? Because don't be like Gideon. Don't. That's not a good idea. I mean, it's not that we can't draw some some lessons, but I mean, if that's all we're getting, like we're kind of missing the point. I mean, yeah, so the treatment of women, I mean, in Judges, we get probably a concentration of women characters, which is more than any other Old Testament book, maybe any book in the Bible. And so here's where you can see like the patterns. Like I just kind of gave you like the downward spiral, but there are so many layers to that, and one of them is women, right? So Caleb's daughter, and part of the challenge is we're reading this in a context very different from our own, and some of our gut reactions might be to just write it off because this is a patriarchal era. So it is a patriarchal era, and that does come through. And so we want to. I mean, personally, I just want to give the benefit of the doubt. So that's the era, and how are the people called to be in that context? Are they just told to uphold patriarchy in the same way that the Canaanites are? I'd say no, that's not the case. If you look at the laws of Israel, that it's different. They still are patriarchal. So let's name that. But something like, and I just did some work on numbers, and we've got the daughters of Zelophehad who, they're saying like, what if our father dies and he doesn't have any sons? Like, what about the land inheritance? And this is like a generation before they actually get into the land. So because the land always passes to the son, the firstborn son, right? So that's patriarchy. But God says, yeah, it's a good point. If a man dies and he doesn't have sons, the women can have it. And then there's some other questions. So it doesn't satisfy like our modern sensibilities, but you can see how there's a pushing back of, and maybe not as much as we like, but there's a pushing back against the culture. I really do think that's what's going on. We'll see time and again in the laws and in these narratives, a kind of pushing back against the culture. But then in a book like Judges, which it really is making the point, right? Like the basic message is like, this is what happens when people abandon Yahweh as their king and then go and enthrone the gods of the nations as their king. And so it's a negative, like the positive message is like, serve Yahweh and build a society based on Yahweh's principles. And but it does it negatively by showing all the negative examples of what happens when you don't. But that spiral downward, it happens with the portrayal of women, right? So Caleb's daughter Axa is, if you read it in the context, she's a very dignified, bold in the best sense, powerful, and she really steps out of even kind of traditional roles, and she's blessed by it, and actually other people are blessed by it. So that's at the very beginning, and then but as things kind of go on, it sort of spirals out of control to the point where at the end the women are the victims, right, from the middle point onward. And I think Gideon, there are two halves of the Gideon narrative. So the one is the fearful Gideon, the other one is sort of the powerful, hungry Gideon. And there's kind of, that's the split in the whole, like that's the dead center of the book. And I think maybe it's when the precise moment is when Gideon is about to go into battle, and then they break their jars and reveal their torches, and then he instructs them to say for Yahweh and for Gideon. So yeah, give Yahweh some praise, but I'll take a little too. And that anyway. So from that point on, it spirals down. So the one negative portrayal of a woman is Delilah, right? Now that's interesting, right? She's a foreigner. And so there are polemics probably going on there too. So I think very positive portrayals of women, or portrayals of victimization of women, which are clearly shown as not the way things should be. If maybe if you want to build a Canaanite society, this is what you can expect, but not in Yahweh's kingdom. No. I still remember a student. I used to assign Judges 19, which that was sort of in my younger years. I think not the most wise thing in retrospect, but I used to assign Judges 19 in an exegetical assignment. And I remember a female student, coming up to me as she was handing it in and saying, Professor Beldman, I need to apologize because there's some unsavory language in here. Because as I was trying to work on this text, I couldn't, I had to use these words or something along those lines. And so we had a really good chat about it. And in a way, I think if our gut reaction after reading Judges 19 is to swear or just to weep, that's the right response. And so I don't know. I heard somebody say oh, well, in the Bible, they promote gang rape and all this, and they point to Judges 19. And I think you have completely misunderstood. Because it's portrayed doesn't mean it's endorsed. So anyway, I don't know if that gets to your question, Ron.
Excellent. Thanks, Ron. Dave, I'm Jess Skolton. I'm also one of the readers for our group. And so it's an honor to have you here to speak with us. So we're very grateful for that. And you've done a great job of helping kind of give an overview of the various ways that the commentary can help pastors. Because that's, you ask who we are. Most of us on this call are U.S. mainline Protestant denominations, but the Academy of Parish Clergy in general is, we aren't too global. Canada, maybe, but an interfaith organization as well. And so we're really just trying to help clergy have these kinds of resources that are helpful for them in their pastoring. So you talk about with the three things and the three elements of what this book is really saying, how God is trying to get deep down in the people. And if you've spent this much time in a book of the Bible to write a commentary on it, what got deep down in you from the experience of spending this much time in Judges and writing the commentary?
Yeah, I think the big my initial response would be the big idea. So the one thing is there's a lot in the background of Judges, right? So I think understanding the Sinai narrative and so biblical theology, I think, is really important, just in general. This idea of Israel's called to build a society, right? To build a culture. And I think with a lot of Christians, anyways, in the kind of circles that I tend to move in or spend some time in, it's like me and Jesus type thing, right? It's just about this personal relationship and, quiet times and this sort of thing. And the big vision, and I think it's really essential for Judges is that, our allegiance to God. And I think there's no difference than, Peter, in his letter, will talk about the calling of Christ followers as a holy nation, a kingdom of priests, the kind of language that we get at Sinai. Now, of course, we're not a nation, so that's different. But I think we are called to take every thought, every moment, every aspect of life captive to Christ and under his lordship, right? And I think that's I think for me, the sobering thing about Judges that's kind of got into me is that, we don't know how compromised we are in our idolatry. We don't know just how radical the allegiance to Jesus should be in the way that expresses itself, not just in a personal thing, which it should, but also in the way that we look at society and think about the pressing issues of our day, right? I'm not sure if that's really answering your questions, the things that got deep down. I think just, again, maybe I'm just restating it, the parallels between the people of God in Judges and the people of God today are just far too overwhelming to miss, really. I don't know if that's getting at your question.
It's I was thinking a little more on a personal level as a head level, but it also was a conversation that we had as well. You know, how does a commentary on Judges then apply? And you touched on it with our Pledge of Allegiance and some of those kinds of things. This kind of cycles that we're experiencing today or have in recent years that then highlight this very similar pattern for sure.
Yeah.
So.
Just on a personal basis, like in my in my doctoral work, and it's definitely, if you pick up the commentary, you'll see this like a sensitivity to the literary aspect of scripture, and how that actually helps us to foreground and uncover what's going on in these books has been really interesting. But then, like, imagination, like I don't think, as this is kind of personal, but like in my upbringing, like just imagination, like just thinking how imagination works and being imaginative, like it wasn't like a real emphasis. And I think engaging our imaginations and then entering into these texts, like the Samson narrative is just if you want a really good book to read, I think it's David Grossman's The Lion's Honey. I think it's called The Lion's Honey. And it's kind of a psychological literary reading of the Samson narrative. And it's so attuned to the literary features, and it's undeniable that like the stuff that this Grossman is bringing out is so fascinating. But just, it made me think of these the characters in the Bible not as just like, flat people or unrelatable people, but like real people with real feelings. And just one kind of interesting example was the whole thing about Samson's mother becoming pregnant, right? So they're barren. They don't have kids. And then a stranger comes in the field, meets with Manoah's wife, and she becomes pregnant, right? Now think about that for a minute. And then she comes to her husband and says, I met this man in the field, and guess what? I'm pregnant. Now, what does he say? He says, I want to know who this is. The next time he comes, you tell me. Right? Are you getting what I'm putting down? And so so then he meets the angel, and look at the dialogue between them. Manoah's very curt, like, who are you? What's your name? What's your business? What's going on? Like, he's very but there's just that, like, I've never heard a sermon on that before, right? And then you think about like, and then also just thinking about like barrenness, right? Like, we know people who have had challenges conceiving, and that just the deep sorrow of that, and that's going on in the text. And then she hears about her son who is going to be this deliverer, and yet it's going to be a hard path. And I mean, just echoes of Mary and all that sort of stuff. But it just, I think for me, just the very earthiness, I think, of these texts, and the very realness of the characters, it's been really neat that way.
So you just touched on it a little bit, and we are a little short on time. I want to make sure if anybody else has questions for you, they're able to ask those. I didn't see any others in the chat. Bob, you're up.
So Dave, I appreciate the introduction and helped give me some sense of why we might want to engage in conversation about Judges. Just to, as a follow-up to the commentary, since Ron brought up, he did a series since the lectionary. Actually, there's twice. There is Epiphany 5C has the call of Gideon, according to what I looked at. But maybe a series of 5 sermons that you could write a little booklet that would pick up and give us 5 sermons from that we should preach from the book of Judges that would help us learn these things. It is true, as you mentioned, with like Samson, is every child knows the story, thinks they know the story of Samson. And yet that's only one portion of Judges. And it's really, Samson's not all that good a character. I mean, he's a savior, but he's an unsavory fellow. So I just kind of a word here is like, could you give us a series of 5 sermons that would speak to our congregations from the book of Judges, since the lectionary has chosen not to do so?
Yeah. I think it's so I'm from a tradition where we do the kind of expository thing, right? So they want to get everything. And I just say, like, look, some books, like you don't want like a 21, if you're doing one chapter per sermon, which is ambitious in itself. Like, you don't want to be 21 weeks on the book of Judges, right? So I think it is possible to do it in 6 or 7 might be easier, but if it were 5, I think really laying the groundwork in the background for, the kingship of God and the calling of Israel, right? So how does God's kingship function, and that's sort of the background of Sinai and so on. And then a sermon on, I think, memory and forgetting, right? So they didn't know Yahweh or the acts that he had done. So how does that apply to us today? Like, I mean, just think about that. What kind of songs are we singing in church? What kind of stories do we tell? Are we giving testimonies of God's work in our lives, in the big picture, and so on? And what kind of rituals are we doing? Because I still remember teaching Leviticus once, and I said, "What do you do first thing when you wake up, or last thing? And does it involve something like this? And is that saying anything about what's important? And is that shaping you in any way? Because rituals shape us. That's what God is trying to do. And I don't know if you know James K. Smith's book, Desiring the Kingdom. He's saying we need these Christian liturgies that are powerful enough to shape our desires. So I guess that would be 2. I would maybe take a selection of the Judges, like maybe the Deborah, take 2 or 3 and sort of unpack, give them a taste of what it looks like. If you've got the big picture, give them a taste of what it looks like with 2 or 3 examples. Samson, I think, is a great one, because I really think that and it was based on my reading of that Grossman. He convinced me that Samson really, he regretted his calling, his special calling, his special status, and actually he just wanted to be a Philistine. And you'll see interesting things. So if that's true, he says things like, "Now I'm just going to do this thing, the revenge thing, and then I'll stop." But then they pull him back in, and then that thing with the narrative with Delilah, like, if you do this, then I will have the strength of one man. If you do this, I'll have the strength of the one man. But when he finally reveals it, he says, "If you cut my hair, not the wording changes, not you, I will have the strength of one man, but I will be like every man." And I think that right there, he's revealing what he actually wants. He doesn't want to be special. It's put him at odds with his own people. It's put him at odds with the Philistines. And if he cuts his hair and becomes like every man, he thinks that's freedom. What happens? He's bound, his eyes are put out, and he's forced into labor, into slavery. And I think that, I'm not a preacher. I very rarely preach, but I think that stuff preaches, right? We think freedom is freedom from religion, but actually I think the message of Scripture is that, living as followers of Christ is true freedom, right? This is life, and life in abundance. Sorry, I can't answer a question in a short period of time. Yeah.
Well, we appreciate, Dave, your coming on, and your interest in doing this. Launched a conversation about let's say if we do it for Dave, let's do it. Well, we should do this. This is like a great idea, and so your encouragement gave us the opportunity to have that conversation about that. Maybe this is a value. Ron, Jess, and I, we read through all these books and determined which books we wanted to honor. and we make a nice listing and we say, here, go read these books. But there's what this is able to do is give some engagement with the author and learn more about the book, but also about the author. So that's the value here is that. So we appreciate your willingness to be our guinea pig in a sense, to be our test subject to help us to learn how to do this. So we greatly appreciate it. We're going to do it again in July, correct? July 8th, I think, Jess, with Caitlin Curtis and her book, Native, which we honored as one of our top 10 books. So this is, we're hoping to have a bunch of these conversations, but, with reference commentaries are those kinds of things. And, that they're not the things you generally sit down and read cover to cover, but preachers go and look for them. And this, I like I said up front, is that the connection of the theology and the exegesis that this particular series offers is a helpful one. And so we appreciate your work there and taking on a book of the Bible that's largely ignored, but also complicated.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think you helped us unpack some of that complication a little bit. Of course, that now takes us back into the commentary to pursue that a little bit more. So thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. I hate plugging my own stuff, but so some people aren't gonna just like go out and get a commentary and read it cover to cover. I do have a little small book, and the only reason why I want to say is because if people like, if it sparked the interest, and other pastors have said that it's helpful. It's just called Deserting the King, Lexham Press. It's like 100 pages, and it kind of distills this. And I think if it does what I hope it will do is it will help pastors get that orientation so that they can sort of get into the weeds a little bit more. So anyway.
No, that's helpful. Yeah, thanks, Dave. And we authors must plug our own books. If we don't plug our own books, no one will. And I say that as one who's written some books. So I understand it. I've been given a message to wrap it up. So Dave, I thank you all. Thank you for those of you who came along. And we're at 3:00 on June.
On the 8th, yes, I believe so.
3:00 Eastern time on the 8th with Caitlin Curtis' book Native, which is really an excellent book. So should be an excellent conversation. Join us then. We will post this, and so those of you who were, so the others can watch this, and we'll send it on to Erdman's, and they can make it available as well. So thanks so much, Dave. Anything from any of the others there? Otherwise, we'll say a good afternoon to all.
Take care.